And since this is my name is Judy Dempsey, and I was going to say, what do I do? I'm the editor of Strategic Europe, involved with the Carnegie Europe Foundation, working with the EU Engage project. And this is our first big hybrid event, and it's great to have everybody here. This is the first thing. And secondly, it's very nice to have young people here. I'm beginning to feel rather old, actually, but it's very good to have a lot of young people here. And actually, the third thing is it's great to have two great guests and an audience here, and also making the time to come here on a sunny Thursday evening. And also, I have to admit, this is my first time back in Brussels because of COVID, and it's also very nice to meet new staff who I've never met until now. So we have a very difficult task ahead of us, and I hope an engaging one, and it's rethinking the EU-MENA engagement. I'm not going to go into details on this. You have the program on through your email and so on, but we really have to have a discussion about whether the EU learned anything from the Arab Spring, or repeating the pre-Arab Spring, or indeed are just now becoming increasingly interested or obsessed with the status quo at a time when the whole geopolitical parameters of the region are changing. So we have two guests. We have Maria Fantappiè, former Special MENA Advisor, the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue. Welcome, Maria, and thank you for coming. And we have, I was going to say next door, it's London. You're based in London? Yeah, because there's offices all over the world now. Emile Hokayem, Director of Regional Security and Senior Fellow for Middle East Security, International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. So welcome to you both. As a moderator, I sort of keep a strict time. You have a maximum of about 8 or 9 minutes. If you want to talk less, fine. If you want to talk more, no. What we will do, though, after you've given your presentations, I'd like to be able to pick you up on some things. And I'm a great believer in opening up the floor to the audience. You know how to raise your hand. And then outside in the terrestrial sphere, you can actually submit your questions as well. So I want to get my timer. And Maria, off you go.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you for having us here today. It's really like pleasant to be in Brussels with such a sunny day. So yeah, we have a very difficult task ahead, and having just landed from the Emirates to Brussels, I was thinking, despite this relatively, geographically, Europe and the Middle East are quite close. But I'm really struck by the fact that there is really an increasing challenge from Europe to keep the pace of the fast-paced transformation that the MENA region is going to. So, and I think that the ability of Europe to be relevant really depends on this ability to keep the pace at this moment. So a couple of points on how the region is changing, at least how I see it, and a couple of points of how I think that the EU can actually keep the pace and maintain or keep some strategic relevance. Well, I think that first of all, the trends of transformation, we had like the glaring example with the Arab Summit in Jeddah in this May, where Assad was invited. So we can say that, yes, we are at the very end of that chapter of Arab Spring. At least the rulers of the region think that this is the case. They want that to be the case. And I think that despite, the interesting thing is that despite they have still geopolitical difference among themselves, I think that we feel when we speak to them that there is quite of an agreement that they have interest in doing diplomacy among themselves and actually getting economic benefit from that diplomacy. Why? I think that because they are thinking that this will also strengthen their new social contract with the society, which is going to be based basically on, I think, on a model which we have seen in the Gulf, a model which is, on the one hand, they give to their society a relative stability, so relative stability and relative security. There are open up to business opportunity for the young generation. But at the same time, there is a limited and controlled space for freedom of expression and political participation. So this is the mix. I'm not sure, we are not yet in the position as a researcher to say this is going to work out across the region, but let's say that this is the thinking behind the fact of saying, let's do diplomacy together, let's actually have economic opportunities, because we can actually, you know, have a quite stable regional order, yet to be seen. The second trend of change, I think it's this idea of gaining more strategic autonomy from their usual providers of security, so therefore of the West, in particular, and particularly the US. I think that the Ukraine war was a turning point because it really provided many of these key regional players, in particular the Gulf, the ability to, in some way, re-engage and step up engagement with other players that are not the US, so in particular China and Russia. And we have seen that the key moment has been the Arab-Chinese summit in December, which the Saudis have hosted. And I think that another interesting element of this sort of like going east towards China is that what we were saying before about more economic interaction, more interconnectivity, more diplomacy happening, well, China is strongly behind that because it wants to invest into the entire infrastructural projects that they actually envision for themselves. And this strategic autonomy that many of these players, they want to gain, and the multipolarism also that they want to play out, I think it also goes along with another trend, which is the fact that they think that if actually they will do diplomacy among themselves, is, for example, players, regional players, which have been at odds for several years, like Saudi and Iran, finally de-escalate, that will also disincentivize like security attacks to happen. So, for instance, Saudis will have less of need of reliance on security guarantees if it actually creates the condition for more interconnectivity with the Iranians, potentially also persuading that it will be high cost for them to engage or to make their proxy, to let them engage in attacks against key facilities. So I think that there are all these dynamics at play. And definitely, I mean, this duality of using both, definitely still deterrence against your rivals, but also using diplomacy and interconnectivity to economic interconnectivity. Now, obviously, this challenge, and this will be my last point on the transformation of the region, the entire sort of idea that we had seen during the Trump administration of an implementation of a regional order that is driven by also the Abraham Accord, where actually the Gulf and Israel will actually have a military alliance against Iran. I think that what will be very interesting to see is how the relation with Israel actually develops. Because I think that, and it will be particularly difficult with this government, but I think that the Abraham Accord, they have actually a future, but not in the way that Trump and then later Biden have thought about it. I think that they have a future as, again, a diplomatic avenues for Israel to integrate itself if it wants to, but obviously that comes also at having or showing some strides on their own on the Palestinian issue. So not the Abraham Accord no longer is a military alliance that polarizes the region, but the Abraham Accord as a diplomatic tool for greater integration of Israel also in the region. But this is like yet to be seen if this will be implementable. But yeah, there is this mood of basically let's do both diplomacy. Let's do diplomacy now. Let's come to Europe, and I think this is the hardest part because while there is all this vibrancy in the region, at the same time, I feel that Europe is totally out of sync of all these developments that are happening. So I think that first of all, I will just mention 3 points that I think are quite problematic. The first one is that there is a need for Europe to clarify its strategic position vis-à-vis of the region, in the sense that when you speak to interlocutors, especially in the Gulf, they ask you, but I mean, how does Europe actually, what is the role of Europe in our strategic equation? where Europe fits in all this new diplomatic and economic flurry. I mean, where does it sit? How does Europe wants to deal with China? We know how does it want to deal with Russia, but how does it want to deal with China? And I think that there is an unclarity when you speak to the different capitals about this, that I think it's a very important point that both, I mean, specifically member states, key member states of the EU and Brussels, they need to have a strategic discussion about these changes that are happening in the region and how they can actually take a clear strategic position vis-a-vis of these changes that are happening. Whether it's by supporting the process of diplomatic integration, whether it's by supporting also the process of trying to keep US-China competition at the minimum level without having escalating, because it benefits both the Arab states and Europe. Let's see. But I think that that discussion is not yet happening between EU member states and Brussels. And I think that the strategies that the Council has approved, honestly, they lay out the common denominators of the EU in the Gulf, of the EU towards this. But they are, if we keep as Europeans at this level, the bar that low, we will not give the message of where we want to be in this new Middle East and in this new global scene that is happening. So we really need to have a strategic discussion about this. Second point, I think we need to also, as Europeans, think where is our added value in this new setting. I mean, regional actors are doing the escalation on their own. The Chinese have actually struck the Iran-Saudi deal. So this idea that Europe de-escalates, this idea that Europe mediates, well, I think that we need to rethink it. Maybe we can do it in partnership with with countries in the region. But I think that especially because we have a very strong position on Russia, we no longer can posture ourselves just as a neutral player as we did back in the days. And third, I will say, which is the most, I think, difficult part, we need to be able to rethink our vocabulary of diplomacy. For so long, and this, I mean, with the European Diplomatic Academy, there is a work that is ongoing. I think we need to shift from the words, we need to advise the MENA states, to words like we need to listen to EU-MENA states. From words we need to support EU-MENA states, to words like we need to partner with them. So we really need to go to a level where our diplomacy with the MENA states, especially the key Gulf states that are now gaining such a strategic importance, it needs to be much more equalitarian, taking into account the role that they're taking into this multipolar world and into the great power competition. That will be not, if we fail at this, I think, I mean, the fact that we either fail or we succeed at this, I think there is much at stake, because it's not only the strategic weight of Europe in MENA region, but also it's our credibility towards the global south. And also it's our ability or non-ability to continue to have a coherent foreign policy. So I think that the MENA is really a ground where we have to test all this. Thank you. Yes.
It was perfect. Thank you very much, Maria. I mean, you've packed so much in, and just listening to you, the EU has failed so miserably in the connectivity issue, on the integration issue, on the regional issue, on so many issues. And I wonder if the MENA countries can do with China as well. That raises big stakes for Europe. So, Emile.
Certainly. So let me first address the geopolitical piece. And I suspect you will see differences with my dear friend Maria. Sorry, don't throw anything at me. Yes, there is the escalation in the region, and that's welcome. It's better that there is no violence and no insults being thrown left and right. Then it's, you know, it's a relatively better moment. Well, I will argue that this de-escalation is sin, it's unstructured, it's disorganized, it's competitive. I don't think that the way it's playing out is necessarily leads to a calmer region. I don't want to use the word architecture, but I'm going to use it anyway. But you know, it doesn't necessarily lead to a security architecture. It doesn't need to what we think is something sustainable and that can weather, what's the global shocks that we're seeing. The current de-escalation is the product of fatigue. The players in the region have understood that they're all like heavyweights and they can box each other as much as they want. No one is going to KO the other one, right? You're not going to have total victory against them. So yes, countries are no longer pursuing maximalist ambitions. They are defining down what is good enough for them in the short term. The second point is, the cost of the past, 10 years, and I'll get to this in a second. The cost of COVID, the higher food prices, higher energy prices for the resource poor countries in the region and so on, have actually had a massive impact on the economic well-being in the region. Actually, you're talking mostly about the Gulf states. Everyone else in the region is worse off. Everyone else, right? Those things that led to the 2011 explosion, it's not just that they exist, they're 10 times more potent. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will explode a second time. I'm not making prediction about a second round of uprisings and so on. But we should not be complacent about it. Yes, things are particularly good in the Gulf right now, right? Well, we'll see. $75 per barrel of oil is the Saudis and others are starting to feel the heat. So hence recent decision. But elsewhere things are tough. And the point here is that yes, there is a prioritization of the transformation prosperity agenda in Saudi, in the UAE. And yes, because they were so involved in the region, if they backtrack or they change how they do things, they pursue influence, it will have a practical effect. My point is that we don't see this necessarily translating in greater stability elsewhere. What is the country that worries us all, right? This is a country where one would have hoped that strong Saudi, strong Emirati, and strong Egyptian interests would, perhaps sadly not lead to a democratic civilian government, but at least keep things in check. And what do we realize? That we may have another massive crisis in the making, right? So what I'm trying to say is, yes, the region is, or countries in the region are aware of the global changes, and the ambitious ones among them, they know that the unipolar moment is behind. They don't want a bipolar world. They don't want to be stuck between the US and China, because they will have to make decisions, in the medium and long term that they don't want to make. They want to benefit from both. So they want a multipolar world, and they want to be the poles, among the poles of this multipolar world. They want to shape, they want to benefit, but they also want to shape the world that's emerging. This is why you see them so ambitious and assertive and aggressive and wanting to organize COP and to, be the Gulf, on the Gulf League and all. They want to embed themselves globally to shape what this new world that, as. Now, all this being said, the geopolitics bit, the regional, what drove the last 10, 15 years of geopolitical competition is still around. No one in the region, including those who have signed agreements with the Iranians, saying that Iran will no longer send weapons to militias, will stop developing UAVs and missiles, will somehow slow or stop its nuclear program. This thing has not been solved. No one thinks that Saudi Arabia is going to say, oh, we believe what the Iranians are saying, let's drop our ambitions to be a military power, to get ballistic missiles, to build our own deterrence, and so on. No one believes that UAE commercial mercantilistic interests have stopped. No one believes that, Egypt, with its very significant domestic economic problems and so on, will stop caring about its neighborhood, what happens in Libya, what happens in Sudan, what happens next door in Gaza, and so on. They're all just tired, and they're trying to, enjoy that quiet moment. But I don't see a track that solves any of this. I don't think that a few years ago we were talking about how, the Gulf states and Iraq can get to a better relationship. I don't think it's in the making. I think the Gulf states have essentially said, you know what, nothing works in Iraq. If we collectively want to believe that the the Sudani government and, is a consensual one that is, you're the Iraq specialist. Please let me know. There is a lot of cynicism about each one. I would say, like on Syria, for instance, yes, Syria is back in the Arab League, and we can discuss if it's good or bad or whatever. But the reason why Arab countries, invited Syria back or welcomed it or whatever, let's say, is not because of Syria itself. It's really to quiet things down, and particularly in terms of Saudi Arabia, to demonstrate its leadership. There is no substantive Saudi policy on Syria, but there was a Saudi moment where, we can do something that the Americans and the Europeans and others don't like, and others in the Arab world are skeptical about. We decided it's there. It doesn't mean, and I don't think that we're going to see a stabilization of Syria because, the Saudis and the Emiratis have decided that, to turn that page. What they've made is a decision to draw a line under a decade of unrest in the region. But I don't see them necessarily involved in like the hard diplomatic work, because that's not the point. The point for a number of Gulf states is that they look at the rest of the region as entanglements, legacy relationships that cost a lot. Those Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq and Syria are countries that cannot be fixed. That you just want to neutralize them. You just don't want to face the externalities of these conflicts, to focus on yourself and build your global standing. Now, when it comes to the EU, I can't do a better job than Maria here, but let me just put where the EU is a bit in perspective. I would argue that the EU was at its apex, at least in the Mediterranean, the region, in the 2000s, where like the project looked amazing and it was expanding, and you had the institutions that looks, the euro came, and I mean, that was a big market and so on. What we saw in the 2000s was the EU focusing on partnerships, right? We want to sign TCAs here, left and right, and so on. You tell me how this partnership went. We can score them, or I can give you my sense of the one I studied, the one with Syria, when the EU decided to go full steam on the TCA with Syria. That's 2007, 8, 9, and so on. The Syrians pushed back a number of things. But what are the two clauses that the EU compromised the most about? The Human Rights Clause and the WMD Clause. What happened 2 years later? You tell me. My point is that sometimes the EU wants those partnerships more. They want to institutionalize the relationship. They see the partnerships as a way to address those issues from a technocratic perspective and offer goodies and so on and so on, without talking about the hard issues. In the 2010s, what did the EU do? The EU had to focus on the externalities of Middle East instability, primarily refugees, migration, and terrorism, and the geopolitical competition. And the EU was pretty much reactive. It wasn't able to come up with, wanted the EU intervene in Syria or not intervene in Syria? Some EU member states wanted to do that. Most of them were saying, okay, we don't know, you figure it out, and so on. Right? Libya was the one moment of cohesion, unity. If anything, it played against But essentially, the EU showed us in the previous decade that it doesn't know how to speak the language of power. And I don't think they solved it. Now, in this decade, what do you have? You have a return of autocratic rule. I think Tunisia is the biggest example of that. We all know, or we all suspect, that it's going to be extremely difficult to get any reforms there, to moderate the behavior of the president, get something on and so on. But we're still going to throw a lot of money at the problem, because what are we worried about? Collapse in Tunisia, that then export, If we can't figure out Tunisia, how do we discuss Egypt, which is 10 times bigger, right? I mean, if we can't figure out policy towards a country that is not a military power and so on, how do we... So now we have to, at the same time as you have what you described, which is figuring out where the EU sits in this changing environment, but also the emergence of global, big power competition in that space. right? The EU now enjoys this moment of cohesion and coherence because of the threats from the East. It is the threats from the South that is still around, and I don't want to sound like scaremonger, but it's still around, and it has, and we've seen in previous decades, has an impact on European politics and security, a direct one. And at the moment, we don't see much thinking about that. I can't fault just the EU, by the way. I mean, it's not as if the others, the Americans and things, have a sense of that. So, in a very complicated space. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Emile, and thank you, Maria. You both packed an awful lot into this. I have a question to both of you. I'm very interested in the element of fatigue. I mean, it was fatigue and the cul-de-sac that actually spurred on the peace accord, the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. Fatigue can be the catalyst, actually, for change. But what's interesting, both of you raise, but don't explore, is that if you have this kind of element of diplomacy and these countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, or anything, how does this play into security? I mean, this surely matters, given the whole architecture of conflicts in the region. You mentioned Sudan, heaven knows what's going to happen in Egypt, you have Tunisia, Iraq unfinished. There's so much unfinished business. There's so much insecurity. Do you see security becoming a building block in this rapprochement? Maria, would you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad that Emile gave the other half of the apple, in the sense that it's so true that this is it's not an order. This is an unfinished business, and we don't know how it is going to end up. And to answer your question, there is definitely I don't think that security is the building block of this order. It's actually the one thing that all these players know. Maybe they can achieve a point where, as I was saying before, they can create the high cost for actually returning to a fight against each other. This is why we don't see, for example, Houthis in Yemen, we have seen that even if there was a ceasefire, even if it wasn't renewed, but there hasn't been major attacks of Houthis on Saudi installation. The same thing we see in Iraq, where the Popular Mobilization Unit, so another non-state actor associated to the Iranians, they don't actually proactively launch attacks against Saudis or other facilities. So I think that securities is sort of not solving, but at least reaching the point where at least there is some red lines. But I'm not sure they will hold, because, the non-state actors, they also have their own interests. So it's not, again, a situation where it's the Iranian who tell them, don't do that. Maybe now it's in some cases, they agree that this red line, they have interest in keeping it. But I don't think that we can put our hand on fire and say that this will hold forever. It's not, again, a Helsinki process. It's not a process where you have a security agreement among states like the West at some point thought and wished to be. Actually, this building block, I think, is infrastructure, is economy. And this is where the EU enterprises come in all this. Yeah.
Maybe we're too fixated on the conventional definition of security, because economy, prosperity, stability is a measure of security. But when you mentioned it, Maria, and maybe Emile can pick this up, this connectivity and this integration, is this seriously for real? Are you serious about it?
You're asking the wrong person. I work at IIS. We count tanks and bullets and things. Anyway, I'll try to answer that one. I'm kidding. There is a connectivity agenda in the region. That's for sure. There are lots of desires. You will hear the Jordanians talk about how they need water and energy and how they want to be, helping to connect Egypt with Iraq and Egypt with Lebanon and so. I mean, and then you have real big projects on right now, like Egypt, the interconnectors where electricity with Greece, and so. I mean, you have some of these big things. Egypt could be an energy powerhouse. They have the space, they have they can do wind, they can do solar, they can do quite a lot. So there's a lot of those discussions, right? But the problem is that is for us to get infatuated in that and thinking that somehow addresses everything else that's happening, right? I mean, you can invest in a large scale like plant and put pipes and so on. What does it do to create basic jobs? What does it do to deal with food security? What does it? And this is the disconnect. We can all think about those big multi-billion euro projects to be funded that will attract elite and could actually calm things down for something. The question is, does it reach? Do the benefits go down a thing? And then the thing with Maria was talking about non-state actors. Yes, it's good that they're not firing stuff at their neighbors and so on. But when they're not firing that stuff, it's not that they are actually behaving nicely. They are, or doing yoga. They are actually consolidating their power in those geographies. So now, yes, it's good that the Houthis are not lobbying stuff at Saudi. It also means that the Houthis are consolidating their power inside Yemen, at the extent of others, and could in the future will emerge as a stronger force. Same thing with the PMF in Iraq. Same thing with Hezbollah in Lebanon. We've seen. So when you don't have active fighting, it doesn't mean that these actors are thinking, oh, let's figure out how to be nice to the wider society and so on. So they continue having their agenda. And I will say, like, Iran itself is showing us that they can talk to the Saudis and create those illusions of de-escalation and so on, and continue doing what they've been doing in the past. There is no way at the moment to measure Iranian compliance with whatever they promised the Saudis and the Chinese. So that's an aspect. And then on the conventional side, we still don't have an agreement in the region to talk about, okay, missile reach, and are we applying MTCR, or should we limit the testing of the? This is not a conversation that's happening. So you still have a conventional buildup that is happening as we speak.
This, Emile, this brings in so many dimensions. If Europe really is behind the curve, the role of the Abraham Accords, the whole question of WMD and how America is going to re-enter into the accord with Iran. Please, I'd like to open this up to the discussion. And anybody out there, if you want to send in questions, there's a chat system, a messaging system, or whatever they call it. But if you want to ask a question, keep it one question at a time. Identify yourselves and say, let us know who you want the question directed to. So you were first, and number two, we take 3 questions at a time. 1, 2.
I'm Emile Badavrin, I'm research fellow at the College of Europe in Nutlin. Thank you for this talk. I just have a comment, not a question, because I'm myself from the region. First of all, I would like to comment on the Abraham Accord, and you said that's a kind of an outfit for integrating Israel in the region, right? This is not the case, because Abraham Accord are signed with dictators and not with the people. It's the same thing with the Camp David Accords, the same thing with the Jordanians, the same thing with the PLO ones. There's no integration whatsoever, plus Israel does not want to be integrated in the region itself. There's ideological questions here. The other question here that troubles me,
Okay. You have to have one comment later. No, it's only fair. Next one. Yes, please. I'll come back to you again. The lady there, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Lavinia. I work in the International Crisis Group here in Brussels. My question is for both. What is your opinion on the appointment of the new EU Special Envoy for the Gulf? And if you have any advice for him?
So, and do we have a third question? Yes, please.
Thank you. Angel Saf, Professor of Strategy at the Saudi Business School and member of the Engage Project, together with Carnegie and many others here. Thank you very much. It was a great conversation so far. So my question has to do with how useful is the MENA as a region and as a category, In particular, I thought the first Maria's description was great, and also the second, and also Emile's. But Maria seemed to be talking more about the Middle East, while on the other hand, the North Africa seems to have be quite a different picture right now. So that's what I see.
The Abraham Accords, which is very important. I mean, you wonder, what the Americans really wanted from this and how you build on it. Then the second one, the EU, the MENA region, and the third one was, yeah. So please, whoever wants to.
Okay. So on the Abraham Accord, so first of all, just to clarify, what I was suggesting is that the formula that was thought of the Abraham Accord in the Trump days, when the UAE and others signed the accord, I don't think that is any longer viable in this. No, of this idea. No, I'm just saying that the idea that there is, like, for example, a military alliance, that the Abraham Accord creates a greater Gulf Israel interaction, but that also has a security implication. So I'm just sorry, but if you let me speak, because it doesn't seem that you are open actually to have this conversation. What I wanted to say is that geopolitical point is not a political point. If I would be an advisor to the Israelis, I would tell them, actually, in this moment, it would be the most smart things to do, if you could, is to actually scale down on your ambition to actually turn the Abraham Accord into a military alliance and actually rethink it as a tool for diplomatic integration. That comes, as I said, at the cost of you making some strides in the peace process, which this government doesn't seem to be able to do. This is the first thing. The second thing, I think it's becoming increasingly, and this is a point, I'm just coming from Dubai and from Abu Dhabi to say that, I mean, really, it's increasingly embarrassing, I think, for countries that have signed these accords to sustain with this Israeli government. So I'm just saying that the approach that was put forward back in the days when it was signed is probably no longer works. The Americans, what I think that they will try to suggest, for example, when it comes to Saudi-Israeli relation, which has been the matter of the latest Blinken visit yesterday, I think that there are some areas of cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel on technology, irrigation. I think that they will try to focus on this. I don't see, and I don't think that Israelis see a normalization happening during this year. For the EU envoy for the Gulf, briefly, I will just be very brief. I think that we go to the last point that I was making, how to reformulate our vocabulary of diplomacy. So I think that the Gulf is the area, and Emile knows better than anyone else this, where there has been a lot of sensitivities about how the EU has worded itself. In terms of like this sense, it's always perceived with the posturing with a sense of superiority, the colonial issue that hasn't been overcome, the discussion on human rights also is often misunderstood or taken under the wrong angle, at least in the way that it is perceived. So again, I think that he is in a good position now to start to rethink the language of diplomacy in a more egalitarian term. And I think that this is a great, platform to test that. And just to link to the last great question that you asked, yeah, I mean, this is not a bloc. This is this region. I think there has been many great articles about how this definition of Middle East, it's actually becoming quite, yeah, I mean, no longer probably relevant. So I think that we should, for example, the EU Gulf envoy, I think it will work a lot with the Horn of Africa envoy. So we need to rethink also this. Maybe we will have in 1 year an event which is just about Horn of Africa and Gulf, for instance. Yeah.
Emile, do you want to comment on any of these questions? I have got 4 terrific questions from outside, if I can. Are you sure you want to come in there? Just one tiny thing in my mind. Israel never took up the Saudi offer over Jerusalem many years ago, which is a great pity. And I just wonder what Israel now thinks of this rapprochement between Saudi and Iran. So I'm going to, very quickly, thank you out there who gave the questions. what type of engagement can the EU envisage in the MENA region at a time where EU universalist values are not very popular, that is democracy and the rule of law? Can I read out the next one? You can hold on to this. Second question, we touched on this, but we can expand. How do you judge China's engagement in the Middle East? For example, mediating relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia while attacking the latter to join the BRICS Bank. And I think there's an Italian somewhere around here. Do you believe Italian PM's visit to Tunisia will help unblock the IMF funding and help reduce summer migration? I'll take two at a time. Four is a little bit too many. Emile.
Sure. Yeah, let me, just looking for the China one first. Let me deal with that. I mean, I was just in Singapore where the Chinese defense minister was there. So I was actually able to ask him publicly, privately as well, but publicly, you know, okay, you facilitated that deal. Do you take responsibility for its implementation? And the answer, that was short, was essentially no. It was vague, but the point of it. And that's essentially, you know, what China, how China wants to operate in the region. It actually expects compliance with the deal because it expects those countries to value the relationship with China so much that they will behave. But there is no, you know, so it's not that China will monitor and enforce, you know, the deal. That it will look at what the Iranians are doing and say, oh, we don't like that, or we, you know, will intercept some shipment there, or we will scold the Saudis for a statement on Iran that, you know, is out of place. I think that this is not at all how China wants to operate in the region. First, it wants to cultivate the illusion that it's really big and powerful, that is currency, that's diplomatic currency, and it wants to focus on its, you know, connectivity projects, on its advancing its economic influence, and so on. It is not, you know, they're interested in. We have a big project that completed some years, but you know, it's digital presence in the region and so on. So there's quite concrete things that China wants, but we don't see them as you know, wanting to take on a strict security role, like I said. And actually, it was quite telling. If you look at the agreements that was negotiated between the Saudis and the Iranians, there is one that reiterates the principle of non-interference in each other's affair. Okay, that's a very general point. And then they bring back the 1998 and 2001 agreements. Remember the music of 1998 to 2001? I mean, it's like 20 plus years ago. They're going back that long. Much better music than now. But the point is that the Chinese did not, you know, there was nothing fresh in it. It wasn't about the substance. It was about, we are China, the big power. You know, we're not going to negotiate the details of your relationship. You know, go in your drawers and pick up something you had agreed on in the past. Let's revive this. But it is our sheer prestige that. Now, the key question for me is, I mean, China is central today to Saudi Arabia's transformation project and to Iran's economic future, given, you know, sanctions and decoupling and what the impact of Ukraine and so on. You know, can China actually invest as much time and capital and saying in those two countries? Does it have to differentiate? Will there be actually competition because one country gets what is denied to another one, or one country, you know, has, you know, greater infrastructure and whatever. So that's one important point. Just on the kind of on the question on engagement, just quickly, I think it's harder and harder to have to talk about values, and I think one of the problems in how the EU, Western countries reacted when Russia invaded Ukraine was to catch it as like democracy versus autocracy kind of thing. I understand why we're doing it, and I think it's a valid argument. But talking to other countries, you know, bringing it back to, you know, international law and sovereignty and Article 51 and whatever makes a lot more sense than calling that, like, you know, the Titanic battle of our age between democracy and autocracy. And I think the leaders in the region are comfortable with their autocratic ways at this point. They think they won the big challenge. Those 10 years are over. This chapter is over. Don't come and scold us again. So I wouldn't lead with that, not because I don't care about it, but because if you do that, you interrupt the engagement way too early. And there will be opportunities in the future.
Just to add on this, because this issue of the values, it's always, I mean, when you go to one of the countries in the region, either as an analyst or even I think diplomats, they find out the same situation. Please, let's not start by speaking about human rights. And they have become, while it's so important to speak about human rights and values, but the fact that maybe we have discussed it in an unstrategic way, it has backfired on even advances on this theme. So again, going back on how to rethink our diplomacy, I think it's still, first of all, it's important not to put it probably as the first topic, just in a matter of being strategic, but at the same time, it's still very important to engage on this, but in a different way. Let's think about other fora on which we can discuss this. For instance, if we discuss about the rights of migrant workers, the rights of LGBTQ community, the rights of women, death penalty, I mean, I think that there is great interest among countries within the region to discuss it also among themselves, because they face actually social pressure of young generation that are actually asking this question: how do we place ourselves? Then there are certain issues that can be addressed maybe more in the practice rather than the codification. Like when it comes to certain LGBTQ rights, at least this is what when we go to the Middle East and especially in the Gulf, they say. So again, there are ways in which we can be more strategic about how to make advances in human rights, without, I think, seemingly portraying ourselves as those one who are the example, because I think we are by far not the example. I mean, we are societies ourselves. Our European society are a society in crisis, and we have to admit that as well.
We're going to get another round of questions in just 1 minute. This values and, well, it's the fatigue as well. The fourth question was, why do we keep omitting Saudi Arabia's 8 years and still ongoing war in Yemen and still engage with it? Actually, it's about European powerlessness. And we've crossed our own red lines in some ways as well. But now that we have this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, maybe, as you said, the conflict may be reduced, but it's very hard to judge.
I think European views on Yemen were not primarily driven by Yemen or an understanding of that. It was just hitting on Saudi, for good or bad, and the Saudis. Not that I agree with the war or thing, but the Saudis have been trying to get out of it for some time. The problem was, how to, and they were not competent diplomatically or militarily to figure out an exit. And actually, the way it's ending is, in a way, the worst possible scenario, where you have an ascendant Houthi movement, you have Iran that is quite entrenched, and so on. But it's not as if the Saudis were completely, we portray their position in Yemen as maximalist on the political side. I don't see it as maximalist at all. I'm not defending at all the prosecution of the war, but if you look at their objectives even before, they're nowhere. They don't compare, for instance, to Iran's objective in Syria, where we're going to crush all opposition. They're all jihadis. We want a centralized state. We're not going to provide a dollar for reconstruction and so on. For the Saudis in Yemen, from the beginning, the statements from the beginning were the Houthis have to be part of the solution. We perhaps will consider a decentralized or federal thing. We will provide money and so on. It's just how the Saudis did it, which showed that they don't know how to do, not that others do. But fundamentally, I will say one thing. All large countries or powerful countries will have a very hard time accepting an armed non-state actor next door with advanced capabilities. Turkey doesn't do that with the PKK. Israel doesn't do that with Hezbollah. What the Saudis have done is, and again, I'm not endorsing that, but it's like normal behavior, right? It leads to very bad outcomes, but it's like how a state sees itself vis-a-vis a non-state actor that it cannot deter on the other side.
this is really interesting because of what Maria was saying, we don't even have the language of different diplomacy to deal with this different mindset. I mean, in some ways, the Europeans are not good at complexity. We have a question here and a question through the other hybrids.
Thank you very much. It's Balaji Meshi from Lucy Europe. And my question is following up on Emile's comment on the Russia-Ukraine, Russian aggression against Ukraine, and how MENA countries see the Russian aggression, and specifically on the question of sanctions. How do you think, speaking of EU, we have an envoy on sanctions as well. Do you think he could be successful in convincing some of the countries, such as the UAE, where we have seen sanctions circumvention happening, to close those loopholes?
Great question. And I'll tag this on with the second question. What can the West do then to build our economic self-power in the region? It might help us counter Chinese influence. So I think the Russia-Ukraine thing is very important because it just shows the distortion of our values and definition of how to deal with authoritarian regimes. Russia-Ukraine, please.
I suspect this envoy is going to spend a lot of time in Ankara, in Israel, and in the UAE, which are the three main, recipients of that money. Look, they're not UN sanctions, right? So they will always have this answer saying, this is not international law. So you have to make a convincing case, and you're not going to apply secondary sanctions because these are three significant economies that are quite embedded and connected to Western economies and so on. So it will be easier for that envoy, I suspect, to make specific cases against specific behaviors, bank licenses or specific individuals and so on, than expect some like blanket abidance by EU and US rule. And to be honest, it's very weird. I mean, the EU is not very good at that game, and it came quite late. The coercion game, the sanctions, and we know how it struggled, a decade ago, and so on. So I'm not even sure, and I don't know. I mean, I'm speaking out of ignorance here, but I suspect that the EU itself has the problem discussing that. I mean, within the EU, you have issues, you have and so on. So I think it's going to be an uncomfortable one.
Like, isn't it that despite their hosting Russian oligarchs and all these, I mean, some of these, isn't it that both the leadership and also the people, they are more sympathetic to the Ukrainian situation? I mean, to the situation the Ukrainians are in, and they, I mean, in private conversation, they recognize where right and wrong stand. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I think that also another strategic mistake that has been done is trying to turn the arm of this country and say, you really have to take a staunch stand against Russia. Maybe it would be more conducive to say, continue to support the humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, continue to be friend and supportive of Ukraine, because the other thing they won't do. And I think that what may help also the enforcement of this, may persuade some of these countries to actually implement the sanction, is the active, effective diplomacy with the Gulf. So again, we go back to the synergies between the EU envoys and how important it is. To me, the EU envoys, they are helpful in this moment because they need to shuttle between the capitals and this key region and among themselves. If that dynamic is in place, we can clarify our strategic stand. We can try it. No, not yet. We are not.
No, that's very interesting. But the person who asked this question, it's also this. Is it double standards? Labeling the war in Ukraine autocracy versus democracy. And what do we have in the Middle East then? I mean, we have authoritarian regimes and no human rights. And what about the younger generation saying, hey, Europe, you're supporting Ukraine. What about us? So, I mean, we're using one language for the Russia-Ukraine war and a language devoid of any content for a younger generation who do want reform in the Middle East. The bottom line is the EU's back to the pre-Arab Spring, supporting the status quo.
The whole discussion about double standards and so on is not one I'm very comfortable with, because every country is going to be
Yes.
inconsistent.
Yes.
I mean, you know, we
Yes.
have this consistency tests that we pass, and of course it's a function of history, and it's a function. I mean, you know, Arab states have nothing to say about the Uyghurs in China, right? I mean, they will talk about you know the double
Indeed.
standards elsewhere,
Indeed.
but we also have you know our blind spots on the Rohingyas or on the thing, and so I mean. And no one is really talking about that the double standard. What I'm trying to say is if you make it purely about values, yes, you can identify the inconsistency here and there.
Okay.
And obviously, it is always a mix of the two.
Okay.
And I don't think that you know those in the Gulf who are strategically sympathetic to Russia or they have something, say, are you know not human beings who don't see the suffering of the Ukrainians. They just think that on balance, it's better not to alienate the Russians to get something out of this whole thing. It's a cynical but understandable view. The question is, can we do something about it? And the problem is, I don't think we've developed the language, and we're dealing with 20 years of essentially failure, Western failure in the region.
Well, you remember the so-called quartet in the Middle East. I mean, that was, let's not go into this. We're going to wrap up in 2-3 minutes. So let's turn it around, and you've described what the interests are of the MENA region. But what are the interests of the European Union towards MENA then? We have the migration issue, the climate issue and so on, but do you have shared common interests within the EU to deal with MENA, or we're just plodding along and reactive? Just think of Tunisia, for instance. Have we learned really nothing from the Arab Spring and now the collapse of what was the Great White Hope in Tunisia?
I think, Judy, the answer to your question is not about the themes, but it's about, again, an internal EU issue about member states and Brussels, this eternal issue now about this. But I think that this is why I spoke a lot about the Gulf, because I think it's an area over there where really it's very, very important to clarify where we stand on a couple of things, and this is why it's important to engage the key EU capitals on this discussion and not have them to just do bilaterals on their own. But we know what are the common. I think that on the one hand, there is the strategic discussion, again, that needs to happen between key capitals of EU member states and Brussels. On the other hand, there is this idea of the common denominators on topics that are very important for the EU, the energy transition, but again, how to work, and let's say even the human rights, but how to word it, and even the role of of companies in the region. How Europe economically can, if this economic interconnectivity really develops, can fit into this. You know, so there are these shared interests, but I think that before even we go into there, or while we are going into there, while we are developing the language on how to speak about green energy transition, blah, 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 we also need to have first this EU member states, Brussels, more clear. The strategic documents that we produce at the Council, they're not enough. They are seen as list of shopping lists or whatever, a list of points, and they are not projecting the strategic vision of Europe. You need Berlin, Paris, Rome, whatever, all these capitals to actually have, on the contrary, to face that this is a changing region and say, okay, our priorities, shared priorities, 1, 2, 3, at the level of the executive, I think.
You have a minute.
I'll just say 2 things. First, it's a mindset issue. We should not be complacent, and I think that's my big concern. Sisi has not, is not going to solve Egypt for us. Said is not going to solve Libya. Assad has very little to offer and so on. It doesn't mean that we can do something fundamental about that at this point. It's not, one should not have those, massive, ambitious dreams about how, that era is over when, we would talk about how to support civil society in massive terms. I think we have to be, but we shouldn't be complacent. We shouldn't lie to ourselves about what they have offered. The second one is, invest a lot more in contingency planning. We cannot, we're surprised at uprisings or war in this country or refugees and so on. I mean, we should stop being surprised. We should actually expect, our systems are going to be stress tested. Like I said. Exactly. I mean, that's another one. That's another one, because everyone thought this was the trajectory. They're going to hate each other forever. They wouldn't see that moment was what I would still qualify as a tactical agreement, but exists that transforms, what others can do in that space.
Very impressed with that you can keep to the time. Our time is up. This conversation could have gone on for a long time, and we've got so many other issues to deal with, especially the rehabilitation of Assad. I want to thank our great speakers, Maria Fantappiè and Emile Hokayem. Thank you for coming to Brussels on this sunny day. I want to thank the great audience and thank the back room, the backstage for the Carnegie Europe Foundation hosting this, and of course EU Engage. Nice to see colleagues from the EU Engage consortium here. Thank you very much for your engagement. It was a fine evening, and you know where to go after this. Thank you very much.